Okay, back in the words over here of Rabbi Tatz, in the world of Bechira, free will, and we left off with a penetrating question that requires a profound answer. And that is that we find that there are great people throughout Tanakh, throughout the Chumash, and the Nevi'im and the prophets and the like, that according to what it writes in the Torah, they certainly sin. And the question is that if the greater a person is, that means that we assume that they are in control of themselves. They're able to watch over their actions and their thoughts and their deeds. And therefore, I'm giving a class right now.
Okay.
Okay? Nice to see you.
That's a class. Okay, bye.
So, the great people, we assume that they are tzaddikim, they are righteous people. Righteous people then are able to control themselves and make the right decisions and certainly not succumb to the same kind of sinful behavior that we get ourselves involved in. So how is it possible then that the great people of all of history were able to stumble and fall into sinful ways? So Rabbi Tatz began explaining that in order to understand the answer to this question, there is a piece of information, there's a reality in the world of spirituality that we must understand. And that's something that we call Yeridos Hadoros. This is the weakening of the generations, which means that every generation that gets farther and farther away, as would be called from Har Sinai, from Mount Sinai, every generation that gets farther and farther away from Mount Sinai, which was the ultimate experience of revelation, of prophecy, of receiving of the Torah, so every generation that gets farther away is going farther down the scales of ruchni, of spirituality, and great spiritual strength and endeavor. There is a famous story with Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, who was one of the great leaders of his generation. He passed away in the 1980s. And he was once on a plane from, I believe, Israel to America. And he had a couple of his grandchildren that were on the plane together with him. And they were serving their grandfather on hand and foot. Whatever he needed, they let him stay in the chair. They took care of him. They got him drinks. They got him food. They propped up his head. They got him pillows. They got him blankets. They didn't disturb him. And they got him svarim that he wanted to learn. Whatever the grandfather needed, they took care of. Sitting next to him was a secular Israeli professor. And he was watching for hours on the flight how these grandchildren of Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky were taking care of their grandfather in the most marvelous way. And so he turned to Rabbi Yaakov and he says, I don't understand. He said, I also have grandchildren. He said, and my grandchildren, they almost don't even pay attention to who I am. If they need something, they ask me to get it for them. And if I need something, I have to get it myself. How is it that your grandchildren are taking care of every little detail on this plane ride? So Yaakov said it's very simple, the answer. He said, you see, by me, my children understand that the older that a person is, the closer he is to Har Sinai, to Mount Sinai. And the closer that a person is to Mount Sinai and the receiving of the Torah, so automatically the higher level of spirituality and holiness they are on. So when my grandchildren look at me, they see me as a link in the chain that brings them closer to Mount Sinai. They see me as a greater person than they are, and therefore it's an honor for them to be able to take care of me, all of my needs, whatever I'm asking for, and even the things that I'm not asking for, because they want that connection to the previous generations. But by you, my dear professor, you believe in Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution, which means that you are actually one step closer to the monkeys than your grandchildren, because time has evolved and they became more human than the previous generations, and therefore they look at themselves as a more elite, human being. They look at you as someone that is closer to the monkey kingdom, and therefore their respective you does not exist. Says Rabbi Tatz, the generations have been going down, and therefore we have to recognize, as he's going to explain, the distance between us and between them is very great, and that's going to alter the way in which we look at the actions of the previous generations. So he says over the following idea, and this is the way that it works in learning, the way that it works in Torah novella and written works. The older the generation, the farther back it goes. For example, the Mishnah is the first codified writings of the oral law. The Talmud comes after that. In the Talmud, the authors of the Talmud, which are called Amoraim, they would never argue on the Tana, on the author of a Mishnah. They will fight it out amongst themselves to understand what exactly the Tana was saying. But the understanding is that the earlier back the generation goes, the clearer was their mind, the closer they were to the Torah, the more Kedusha, the more higher levels of holiness they were on, and therefore their understanding and their wisdom is supreme compared to ours. Take it down another generation, you get what's called Ga'onim. The Ga'onim cannot argue on the Amoraim, on the Talmud, but they can argue amongst themselves to understand what was said, because they acknowledge that an Amora had a greater understanding and a greater insight and a greater level than them. So on and so forth, all the way down to later generations. Each generation looks back to the previous generation and sees the greatness in their scholarship, the greatness in their souls, the greatness in their spirituality. So now what does it have to do with our answer? So he says like this. I'm just in the middle of giving a class.
Anybody there?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Shalom. No problem. So, so he says like this, that each retroactive process continues, and each previous stage is far greater than the later. The previous one is greater than the latter. However, when we reach back to the interface with prophetic generations, we go back to the Nevi'im, to the prophets, the gap becomes a chasm, which means we are entirely unable to imagine the greatness of people that were capable of having prophecy. The nature of a human who could sustain a communication with the divine, with Hashem, is entirely outside of our frame of reference. Meaning, I could read a book, and I could understand the ideas that are in the book, so I can think to myself, well, then I understand what this great mind was thinking 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 300, or 1,000 years ago. But when you get into the realm of a prophet, which is the Torah is filled with prophecy, at that point you have to acknowledge and admit, I don't know what prophecy is. It's above and beyond the wisdom that a person can gain in this world. And therefore, I really can't have any true understanding of the prophetic visions and the words of those prophets that existed before me. And therefore, prophecy represents a level so sublime that the modern mind cannot comprehend it in meaningful terms. Now, this is going to be a big part of how we're going to go forward to understand this. Because if the great people of the Torah were on the level of prophecy, that means that whatever decisions they made in their lives is based upon a prophetic level. And we who are far from the world of prophecy was buried already 2,000 years ago, maybe even more than 2,000 years ago. And therefore, we can't begin to fathom what was going on in their minds when they were making these decisions. So then he writes like this. When we develop an awareness of this scale of greatness, and we gain some understanding of how far superior the earlier generations were, and we then learn that those transcendent personalities committed sins that only on the coarsest of our lowliest generation may be suspected of, the problem is obvious. Meaning, if you're a Navi, you're a prophet, and you're living on a different plane of existence, so how could you commit adultery? If you're a prophet and you're holding on the greatest level of spiritual of existence, so how could you go and kill somebody that you're not supposed to kill? So in our minds, the actions of these people make no sense at all. So he says, I want to make matters worse now, says Rabbi Tatz. Let's just thicken the pot, as they say. The Gemara says over the following. It lists a number of characters from Tanakh, from the Bible and the like, who are documented in the Torah as having done a sin. The Torah says explicitly, this person did a sin. But the Gemara says over the following, and it's referring over there to Dovid HaMelech, King David, who we said, seemingly committed an act of adultery. He killed somebody, and he committed adultery with that man's wife. So the Gemara says like this, anyone who says that King David, sinned is mistaken. He didn't really sin. So how can the Talmud contradict what it says in the Torah? The Torah says black and white, the whole story that evolved. And in the evolution of the story, we see Dovid HaMelech did something shady over here, something shady over here, all for the sake of marrying this woman Bathsheba. So how can the Gemara come along and say, oh, no, it wasn't really a sin? And if you think that he sinned, you're wrong. He didn't sin. So if the Torah is clear when it describes the sin of the great people, how can the Talmud come along and whitewash something that's explicit? And if these two aspects of the Torah should be the written word, which is saying that he sinned, and the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, which is saying, no, he didn't really sin. So if they're really in genuine conflict, so then which one is right? Is the written word right, or is the oral word right? Did those great people in history, did they sin, or did they not sin? That's the question that Reb Tatz over here is leaving off with right now. So we'll keep this in mind. This is going to be the contradiction, the seeming contradiction that we're going to have to deal with. And the answer is going to be quite fascinating and very much along the lines that we've been discussing all of this time of wherein lies one's power of free will and the decisions that they make. And hopefully the answer will be something that is encouraging to us of how we're going to make better decisions in our life as well. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Rabbi?
Yes, George.
Was David considered a prophet?
So he definitely had something that was called Ruach HaKodesh, which is divine inspiration. Whether or not he was on the full level of prophecy or not, that remains that could be arguable. But certainly Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, which is also close, it's close to prophecy, that he certainly did have. Okay.
So a prophet can contradict the Torah?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily, meaning maybe he didn't really do anything wrong. We just don't know how to look at it.
Well, you used the example, he killed and he had adultery or somebody else, another prophet. That's contradictory to the Torah.
Right, you're right. That's what it looks like. So we'll have to see.
All for selfish reasons. For David, it was selfish reasons.
All right, okay. So you're touching on the problem over here, and we're going to have to see how we explain the acts of King David and the other greats that we find inside the Torah.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Have a great day, everybody. Hope to see you in person next week.